Good afternoon and a warm welcome to you, our in-house audience, and to the many viewers who are watching us on Zoom. My name is Claire Lyons, and I'm the Curator of Antiquities here at the Villa, and the curator of the new exhibition now on view on the second floor, The Kingdom of Pylos, Warrior Princes of Mycenaean Greece. Today is a celebration for us. The Villa reopened to the public yesterday, and this is our... This is our first in-person program after the Palisades fire swept through 6 months ago. Local friends and neighbors will find the surrounding area much changed from the absence of over 1,400 trees that were cut on this property. But fortunately, our building and collection were safeguarded, and it's truly wonderful to see visitors here once again. Recognizing the Gabrieleño Tongva people, whom we honor as the original caretakers of this place known as Tovaangar, planning is already underway to reimagine the site's native environment, its landscapes, and vistas. This afternoon's lectures celebrate the reopened villa as well as a landmark exhibition. The Mycenaeans have often been glimpsed through the lens of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the two famous epics of the Trojan War and its aftermath. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, which gave Mycenaean culture its modern name, and warriors like Odysseus and Achilles color our imagination of prehistoric Greece. Among those heroes was the legendary King Nestor, who sent the second largest fleet to Troy and returned safely to his homeland in Pylos. Through the objects on display, our aim is to reveal the history behind those myths and the science behind some spectacular discoveries. This is not just the first exhibition to focus on Pylos and ancient Messenia, a region in the southwest Peloponnese. It is also the first major display of Mycenaean culture and art outside of Europe, and it features over 230 finds, many of which have not been shown to the public before. We are grateful indeed to the Ministry of Culture in Greece for the opportunity to bring this unique material to Los Angeles, and to the archaeologists whose exciting research has advanced our understanding of the Greek Bronze Age. Two of them are with us today. Let me now introduce our special guests, and I'm going to do so rather briefly because their current positions speak to prolific careers as eminent authors, excavators, and leaders in the field. Sharon Stocker is a senior research associate in the Department of Classics at the University of Cincinnati and co-director of the Palace of Nestor excavations in Greece. In 2015, Sharon found and excavated the grave of the Griffin warrior. She followed that up with the discovery of two monumental Mycenaean tombs in Pylos in 2018. Her accomplishments have been recognized by the President of Greece and by the Giuseppe Sciacca Foundation of Vatican City. Jack Davis, the Carl W. Blagan Professor of Greek Archaeology at the University of Cincinnati, is co-director with Sharon of the Palace of Nestor excavations. He is among the leading scholars of Aegean prehistory and has been honored with the Gold Medal of the Archaeological Institute of America. Timothy Potts, the Maria Hummer Tuttle and Robert Tuttle director of the J. Paul Getty Museum, will lead a conversation with Jack and Sharon and with you after their presentations. Tim holds a PhD from Oxford University specializing in Near Eastern archaeology during the Bronze Age. Prior to joining the Getty in 2012, he led the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, and the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. Please join me now in welcoming these three distinguished scholars as I invite Sharon to the stage.
Thank you, Claire, for that very generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here tonight. We're very honored that we're the first speakers after the reopening of the Getty. It's an amazing experience to be here and also to see the material that we excavated in such a wonderful display. And I would like to start by thanking the people who have made this exhibition what it is, our colleagues from the Greek Ministry of Culture in Kalamata, Greece, as well as a few members of the Getty team. Of course, the Getty team is very, very large, and it takes a village to put an exhibit together, and we're grateful to all of them. Tonight we're talking to you about southwestern Greece, as Claire said, a place called Messenia, and you can see the circle which highlights the area. We're talking specifically about the area around the Palace of Nestor. I've included a timeline because the chronology is a little bit confusing, and unfortunately I need to jump forward and backward a little bit. But we start really in Greece on the mainland with the Tholos tombs that were built around 1650 BC, and we end with the destruction of the Palace of Nestor in 1180 BC. Jack is going to talk briefly about the Minoan civilization that precedes the period of the Mycenaeans on the mainland. The Palace of Nestor was discovered in 1939 by Karl Blegen and a colleague of his, a Greek colleague, Konstantinos Kouraniotis. And I show you Karl Blegen here on the left. 1939, as you probably know, was not a good year to start an excavation in Greece. And unfortunately, Karl Blegen needed to leave off his work, and he could only return after the Greek Civil War in 1952. And from then until 1968, he excavated with his colleague from Cincinnati, Marion Rawson, and they uncovered a fairly complete Mycenaean palace. This is the most well-preserved Mycenaean palace in Greece. So here is a plan, and it appears in the wonderful book that is on sale in the bookstore that was edited by Claire as the executive editor. So it's a large complex of rooms. There are approximately 105 total, and it consists of 4 separate buildings. We're going to talk mostly about the main building, which is in the center. And here is a lovely reconstruction of the complex that was put together by the Archaeological Service for the reopening of the site in 2016 that's now covered by a brand new roof that I'll show you in a few minutes. Karl Blegen was extremely lucky, and on the first day of excavation in 1939, he uncovered what is known as the archives room of the palace. And this contained over 1,000 clay tablets that are called Linear B tablets. And the amazing thing about this find is these tablets were never meant to be preserved. They were written on raw clay, and they're yearly records. And at the end of each year, they would put them in water, and they would squish them up, and they would rewrite on them in the following year. But when the palace was destroyed by a fire, it baked the tablets, and so that's why they're so well preserved today. Unfortunately, they don't tell us anything about the myths and the legends and the history and the beliefs of the Mycenaeans, but they rather record economic activities or offerings to gods or rations to people who are working at the palace. So it's fairly mundane information that they recorded, but they're very helpful for us in deciphering what's happening in the Mycenaean period. And the decipherment has shown that they're the earliest written form of the Greek language. This is just a little reconstruction of what the archives room would have looked like. There's a scribe who is writing on them and somebody who is actually making them with a basin of water there so that they can form the size that they'd like them to be. The interior of the Palace of Nestor was decorated with amazingly colorful wall paintings. And I think that I didn't mention that this dates to probably around 1300 BC, and it was destroyed around 1100 BC. So we're talking here around the period maybe 1250 BC when these wall paintings were put onto the walls. And the plan shows the highly decorated floor in the three-room suite that was called a megaron. And this was where the king would have held his court. And here is a wonderful reconstruction of the throne room with the hearth in the center. It was produced by a very famous archaeological illustrator by the name of Piet de Jong. And as I said, the floors were decorated, but so too were the walls. And these are just two examples. The one on the left is what we call the lyre player. And Claire mentioned ties with Homer. And this represents a bard sitting on a rock who is playing a lyre. And the bird perhaps represents the winged words of Homer. This is a common description in Homeric epics. The one on the right, of course, is a scene of combat, and many of the wall paintings were detailing subjects of war or hunting or masculine prowess. Here's the new shelter that was constructed by the Ministry of Culture, and the site was closed for several years, but it reopened to the public in 2016. So this is the final period that I showed you on the timeline, and now we're going to move to an earlier period. And we're going to talk about big beehive tombs that are known as Tholos tombs. And the Palace of Nestor is in yellow, and the area that is highlighted in red is the field where the team that Jack and I direct has been working since 2018. And the yellow line leading into the reddish field is a Tholos tomb, a beehive tomb, that was excavated by Carl Blegen in the 1950s. These beehive tombs started to be constructed in the area of Messenia around 1650 BC. So these are essentially the earliest remains that we have on the site that later became the Palace of Nestor. And these were used for communal burials, and we now know, thanks to DNA analysis, that they were used for families. It was assumed in the past that they were family burial monuments, but DNA has certainly confirmed that. And I'm showing you the inside so you can see the curvature of the wall, but also there's a person there to give you a sense of the size of these tombs. They're really quite massive. And this one is about 35 feet in diameter. These were used, as I said, for multiple burials, and after each burial, a wall was built in the entrance, and then the walkway was filled with earth, so that people did not go in and out until there was another burial. This is what the blocking wall looked like when Carl Blegen excavated it, so it was impossible, really, for people to get in. Unfortunately, these were my husband doesn't like the word looted, but the material was upcycled in antiquity. So things were taken out, and some were put back into circulation, and some were melted down. But in most cases, when we find such tombs, the material has been removed a long time in the past. And so it's not modern grave robbing that's taken place, but more things that already happened in the Mycenaean period itself. Nevertheless, there are always a few artifacts that the people who are removing the objects miss. And in this case, the lovely seal stone that's on display upstairs and also a gold ring were found by Carl Blegen's team. I'm going to turn now to our excavations. We started our project in 2015, but we only began to work in the field that you see in front of you with the grapes in 2018. And the story is that this is where we always wanted to work, but we had not yet received permission to excavate in this field when our project began in 2015. And we had 30 people coming, and we were desperate to find a place to work. And the Ministry of Culture allowed us to work where we discovered the Griffin Wire. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but sometimes Plan B is better than Plan A, although in this case, both Plan A and Plan B worked out extremely well for us. This is the field at the beginning of the excavation, and this is what it looks like now. So we started with something that was perfectly flat, and in 2018, very near the beginning of the excavation season, we discovered 2 new large beehive tombs. The one on the left, which is the smaller, we call the Tomb of the Blue Glass. And it's actually the smallest tomb in the area, but it's still about 25 feet in diameter, so it's not really that small. And here are a few examples of objects that were found inside. Some beautiful blue glass, probably from the Near East, and these pieces are also on display upstairs, as well as a lovely gold ring that shows 2 cows between sheaves of wheat. The larger of the tombs we call the Tomb of the Gold Foil, and that's because we found thousands of pieces of gold foil inside of it, and these probably were used to decorate the burial shroud or a coffin if a coffin was used in there. This is very large. It's 15 feet deep, and it's about almost 40 feet in diameter. And it has, in this image, there's a stairway that we dug into it because we needed a way to remove all of the stones from the inside. So everything that you see here is kind of how we left it. It would have been totally devoid of any type of material when it was in use. And then we also dug a stairway into the entranceway so that we could go down in and remove the material. This is the section that was left in the middle, and it's a wonderful example of how archaeology works because there's the material that's on top that represents about 2,000 years of soil blowing into it, into filling up the bowl that was left. The dark layer represents the classical period. So this tomb was used even after the Mycenaean period ended. And below the dark layer is the collapse from the roof when it all fell in. And at the very bottom was the floor as it would have been originally in the time that it was in use. And amazing objects have come out of this, including cloisonné beads and gold foil bee, as well as buttons that were probably put over an ivory core. Most unusual are pendants in the shape of the Egyptian goddess Hathor. And there are 2 of them, and they mirror each other. So one shows the front side with the cells of stones that are in the cloisonné cells and the cloison cells. And on the back then is an incision of the goddess and what is represented on the front. And then the one on the right is an X-ray that we show you so that you can see how the gold was inlaid. Now, the goddess Hathor is an Egyptian goddess, and she's unheard of in the Mediterranean at this time, in the Aegean, I should say, in Greece and in Crete. And so we were very surprised to find these 2 examples in the Tholos tomb. And ironically, the Egyptian specialists do not think that these were made in Egypt. And so as we say, they don't want to accept them as Egyptian. So we've looked for a home for them, and it appears that they were made in somewhere along the coast of modern Lebanon. So the people there imported Egyptian iconography, and they made these into pendants, and then they sent them to Greece, probably on a trade ship. Here again is the field, and I'm going to move to tell you a little bit about the grave of the Griffin warrior, which you can see in a little red square that's on the left towards the bottom. And so the square outlines the entire size of the grave. And in comparison with the reconstructed Tholos, you can see how very small this grave is. In addition, this image shows all of the stones that have been removed from the inside of the Tholos tomb. As you'll recall, when I showed it to you at the beginning, it was covered with currant vines, and now it's a field of stones. And we have them all sorted by the way the Tholos was excavated. So if anybody is curious about how the dome would have been, feel free to come and study all of the stones. It's something I'm not going to do. So turning to the grave of the Griffin warrior. As I said, we found this, we were working in this field, even though it's not our original intention, it wasn't. And we started with an olive grove. And we noticed that there were several stones on the surface of the earth. And we decided that we would put one of our 8 trenches in here. And it turned out to be a very fortuitous decision because it's the only trench out of the 8 that yielded any types of finds. This is the grave after day 3. We had the entire outline of it, but we hadn't found any material that suggested there would be anything that was preserved in there. And at this point, it really could have been anything. It could have been a sheep shed, it could have been a storage shed. Although it looked like a grave, we didn't really want to get our hopes up too high in case that it wasn't. By day 6, the cover slab, one of the several cover slabs that would have been put on top of the grave, began to appear. And notice that it's not touching any of the walls. And so it had fallen in soon after the grave was dug, because there was still enough material in the bottom to keep it in place, to prevent it from falling over against the wall. This is what it looked like after 2 weeks. Here, we begin to see objects that are recognizable. There's a mirror in the center and a large bronze basin that is actually resting on the chest of the man who's buried in the grave. And again, the stone that made it very, very difficult to excavate until we straightened it up and tied it off with a car jack. It's amazing what sophisticated tools archaeologists use to get their work done. Here's the mirror. It's a nice bronze mirror with an ivory handle that's decorated with rosettes. A lot of our bronze is in very bad shape because the natural soil is clay and it's very moist, and that's not good for the preservation of metals. And so this mirror was too fragile to travel, so it's still being conserved in our laboratory in Greece. After about 3 weeks, we found the end of the necklace that's on display. And so we're talking about the middle of June here. And unfortunately, we were not able to remove this until the middle of September. And this caused a great amount of stress. And this is when my hair turned gray, because we needed to leave every night with this amazing necklace in the ground. And although we had security guards, it was still a very unpleasant feeling to leave it. We covered it with bags of soil, but that's not really doing a lot to protect it. Here is the first gold cup that came out. So we didn't know until we found the necklace that there was actually any gold in the grave, because we had found a lot of bronze and some silver, but not really very much gold. And this is also on display upstairs, as is a second gold cup. And this was wrapped in textiles, and the area in green represents the pseudomorphs of the original fabric that has long since decayed. This is the upper layer of artifacts, and what we found as we dug down, that there was a second layer of artifacts underneath here. So the bronze is represented in green, purple it represents the silver, and everything in yellow is gold. Right before we got to the second layer of artifacts, we removed this bronze basin that you saw in one of the earlier slides. And visible in this is a lovely, very heavy double axe that's very similar to those that are found in Crete. I show you that here. And an ivory comb seen before cleaning and after cleaning. This is resting on a piece of the warrior's armor, and we only know that because we x-rayed the metal and we can see along the edge the holes that were used for lacing the two pieces together. Without the x-raying of the material, we would have very little understanding of how the objects work because of the corrosion, which prevents us from seeing it. Here's an example of armor from a tomb near Mycenae, a chamber tomb at Dendra. And in addition, we found various pieces of boar's tusks that were used for helmets or for a helmet. In this case, one is reconstructed on the armor, and here is a wall painting from the Palace of Nestor that shows the individuals wearing boar's tusk helmets. We removed the top layer of artifacts. There were traces of wood, and we came down on the lower layer. This is where all of the precious objects were found. So the two gold cups are visible, as is the man's sword. The necklace, you can see the end of it still there. It's buried, unfortunately, under the rim of the bronze basin. And the red dots represent seal stones. And this image, this is one of my favorite because it shows the colors that would have been in the grave. And color was so important in the funerary display. So we have gold and we have carnelian and agates visible here, and then some type of stone that might have been blue originally. And at the very top I'm going to point, hopefully I'm not going to turn this off, but here is the Pylos combat agate. And so it looks extremely innocuous here. And if you've seen the exhibit, you know what an amazing piece of art this is, and you'll see more images of it in a few minutes. And the stone in the center, the seal stone in the center, which is made of carnelian, is a scene of bull leaping, which was a sport that was very popular in Minoan Crete. And so I say sport, I use that word lightly, because somebody would run at a charging bull, and the bull would lower its head, and the individual would grab onto the horns and flip over the bull's back. So you can see the man in the air. He's just let go of the horns, and he's about to land behind the charging bull. And one of my favorite seal stones then is the green jasper lion. I think he looks very, very regal. A few beads that came from the tomb. One is a baboon, which is a very Egyptian motif, and a carnelian dog, and then a darker carnelian bull's head. The final layer of artifacts that I've been talking about, many things have been removed here. Again, the necklace is visible. It's still there. It's still there. And then the sword of the individual is at the very top. And when we first started excavating, we didn't understand that the gold pommel was attached to the bottom end of the sword because there were so many finds that were on top of it. But here I show you the hilt and the pommel of the gold sword, which is on display, just the upper part, because the blade itself is very corroded. And this is made of an extremely rare technique called gold embroidery. And this consisted of putting thousands and thousands and thousands of tiny L-shaped pieces of gold into a resin on top of ivory, and then polishing them and incising a decoration on top. And so this is 2 millimeters, and these are some of the pieces of gold. They're just teeny. It's very difficult to see them with the naked eye. And so it would have been something that could only have been purchased by somebody of extraordinary wealth. It would have taken a long time to create something like this. Here is the the hilt, and then you might be able to see the decoration. It's lions attacking wild Cretan goats that are called agremion. So the lion on the right is attacking the goat, which has its mouth open. It's kind of a little sad. But anyway, it shows the prowess of the wild beast and the ability to conquer nature. Here is the necklace. Now you can see that it's wrapped underneath the rim of the basin, which is why we weren't able to remove it until we had removed all of the material on top and some amethyst beads that are scattered throughout the image, and the necklace, which is truly extraordinary and is on display. It's about 2 feet long, and there are agate beads and then probably a lapis lazuli bead that has lost its color in the center. Finally, in the middle of October, we were at the end of the excavation, and we removed the skull of the warrior as a block so that we could excavate it in a more controlled environment. Our physical anthropologist came, and she did that. But before that, we took the skull to the Kalamata Hospital for a CAT scan. And this basically closed down the hospital. This is the first time that they have actually x-rayed or done a CAT scan on somebody that has been deceased for this period of time. And everybody wanted to participate in it. But the results are amazing because the gold beads, the little areas that are highlighted are gold beads, and there's also a silver ring that's visible in the upper right in the center. That's the pelvis portion of the individual. And so it helped us in the final stages of the excavation. From the skull, we had a forensic anthropologist who was able to make a facial reconstruction of the individual. And so this is an approximation of what the Griffin warrior would have looked like in life. With that, I'm going to hand the podium over to Jack, who's going to tell you a little bit about the finds that have come from the grave.
Thank you, Sherry. Of course, we worried enormously about who was going to pay the hospital bill. And we were very relieved to find that his medical card still covered the expenses. So I say that in praise of the Greek medical system. So let me carry on then. So who was this Griffin warrior? And that's what I'm going to be talking about here. In order to talk about the Griffin warrior, I also want to put him in a bit of context. This is not the first very wealthy, princely warrior grave ever discovered. The first to ever be discovered was discovered in the later 19th century by the most famous Greek archaeologist of his day, Christos Tsoundas, and it was near Sparta. You see Sparta here on the map inside the circle. He discovered something called the Vaphio Tholos tomb. This is how it appears today. It was never in very good shape. Ours is in much better shape, but amazingly it had a schist grave cut into the floor, and there were wonderful things in that schist grave, including the so-called Vaphio cups. 2 of them. They've been very controversial about where they were manufactured. Some people think both on Crete, some people think both on the mainland Greece, some people think one on the mainland of Greece and one on Crete. But leaving that aside, there's scenes of bull hunting and the capture of bulls. There's a more violent one and a tamer one. So we had in mind, of course, when we began to explore this grave and recover artifacts from it, we knew all about the Vaphio Tholos and the Vaphio schist. These finds are on display in the National Museum of Athens today. But Sherry mentioned that we found another gold cup. And this is a cup of the same shape as those found in Vafio. In fact, this is so characteristic that we've come to call the shape itself a Vafio cup. It's an extraordinary piece. It's all solid gold, very, very heavy, heavier than many of the other similar cups that are on display in the exhibit upstairs. But it's also extraordinary because of the relief decoration of spirals, of running spirals. This is the most prominent relief decoration ever found on a gold vessel of this sort. Also, what's extraordinary about this cup, we have to go to Egypt for this, and this is the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut. And Queen Hatshepsut had her chief engineer, her chief architect, was a guy by the name of Senenmut, and this is all at Thebes in Egypt. And there were wall paintings on the walls of Senenmut's tomb. This reconstruction, this actual wall painting, is reproduced from images that are online in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. But what it shows is a procession of people, Aegean-type people coming from the Aegean area, and they're carrying objects in a procession to hand over as gifts to the Egyptians, almost certainly to the Egyptian pharaoh. And they're carrying these Keftiu cup, or these Vafio cups also. These people are identified as the Keftiu, which seems to be the name applied by the Egyptians to people living in the Aegean area at this time, probably on the island of Crete. The left-hand figure is carrying a cup that's remarkably similar to the one I just showed you from the grave of the Griffin warrior. Now, we started to call him, in addition, we called him the Griffin warrior because we had a visitor to the site when we found him. And he called his wife back in New Paltz, New York on his cell phone, and he was describing the grave and discoveries, including we had representations of this mythical griffin, eagle, part lion. And he described this to his wife, and his wife said, well, they should call it the grave of the Griffin warrior. So we did. We could have called it Tholos or grave number 12 or something of that sort, but it would not have had the same cachet. So we've been pretty lucky with Griffin warrior. But he was certainly a lord of gold rings too. Now, here I need to jump down to the island of Crete, which is the large island to the south on this map, because so many of the things that we found in the course of the excavation either come from the island of Crete or were produced by craftsmen from the island of Crete. There's no agreement on this. I think almost everything's from the island of Crete. Sherry has different opinions, but what husband and wife pair don't? When we think of the island of Crete, one thing we think of in particular is the palace of Minos at Knossos, and I show you a nice distant view of this amazingly large palace complex excavated by Sir Arthur Evans toward the beginning of the 20th century. Compared to what was going on in the mainland at this time, this is so overwhelming. Nothing like this existed on the Greek mainland in the 15th century BC. Power was focused at Knossos. Now, why Lord of the Gold Rings? We found 4 gold rings associated with this burial. That was a big surprise because 4 gold rings are more than have ever been found in association with a single burial on the Greek mainland. But also interestingly, the iconography of each of these gold rings is borrowed from Crete. This is Minoan civilization iconography. We have bull leaping, which Sherry talked about before. This is a pretty hefty sized gold ring. We have scenes from Minoan religion, a goddess descending from the heavens. Interestingly, she's carrying a staff, and the staff is topped with the horns of a bull. And if you up in the exhibit, you'll see that we found a bronze head of a bull that seems to have been a finial for a staff that was buried with the grave of the Griffin warrior. Another scene from Minoan religion shows a seated goddess, and she's holding a mirror. That's interesting. But she's being approached by a worshiper who's carrying something. Now, we're not quite sure what that is. We thought a bull's horn. It's been suggested that it may also be a hippopotamus tooth. We know that those were traded in the Eastern Mediterranean also, but she has her feet on a footstool, which is a very characteristic position for a goddess of this period. But the most impressive of all the gold rings, and this is the second largest gold ring ever found in prehistoric Greece. It's almost a few millimeters, it would be the largest. But we're satisfied with second largest. It's an incredibly detailed scene from Minoan religion. We have the sea at the bottom, we have the strand, the seashore, even the grains of sand are visible. We have a shrine in the center flanked by palm trees. We have women dancing, 3 of them, to the left. There seems to be a maturation ritual. Probably the woman in the center is older. She's probably a goddess. But 2 younger women who lack developed breasts who are being initiated into the cult of the goddess. And on the right, we have women singing, and they have their hands up to their mouths. There's this whole ring is characterized by marine motifs. Even the band of the ring on back has shells all around it. This ring, the design on this ring was probably copied from something else on the island of Crete. And we have ceilings from the island of Crete, which I show you one of them to the right of this image, that it's the same thing. It's the 3 women dancing, and it's a shrine flanked by a palm tree. So somewhere there must have been a bigger version of this entire scene that inspired various craftsmen of the day. And that's true too. We have these same singing women on other seal impressions. And the scene in general reminds us of the wall paintings that flank the actual throne in the palace at Knossos itself. You see here the red palm trees on both sides. And I mentioned the bull's head on the staff. Here's what it looks like, and it's in the exhibit upstairs also. So there are several different natures of the Griffin warrior, of the man buried in this tomb, that are represented among his finds. He also is shown in combat. Sherry's mentioned his weapons. We have many scenes of combat from this period from contemporary burials. Heinrich Schliemann found this wonderful gold ring on the upper right side of the slide toward the end of the 19th century that he called a battle in the Glen. It's a warrior with a dead warrior on the ground before him, and he's about to harpoon a shield-bearing warrior to the right. But none of these scenes of warfare really compare with the combat agate that Sherry's mentioned, because here we have, this is very tiny. It's about this big, and you see it up in the case. You can examine it close up. It's very tiny. In fact, initially it was so encrusted we really had no idea what it was until it was cleaned, until we could identify it under the microscope. And the smallest details in the representation are less than the size of the diameter of a hair in my beard. It's really extraordinary. So it's a triangular composition. The dead man on the ground in front. There are 3 separate planes here. We have some sense of the landscape, which is extremely unheard of in this period so far back in the past. The hero himself, very much like a Homeric hero, is almost naked. He only wears a kilt. And he is not protecting himself by any defensive weapons. His opponent, immediate opponent, has a high shield, and you can zoom in on that upstairs too and see it. Heroes don't really need to have defensive weapons, I think, is the message that's being given here. It's only the other guys who are weaker than the hero who need to resort to such ends. The man on the ground, when we first published that, his tartan kilt was claimed by the Scots, who celebrated that in newspapers in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Now let's look at some of the details. This has been an extraordinary lesson for us in understanding so many aspects of ancient warfare. Here's the hero. The hero is wearing a seal stone on his wrist. So just like the seal stones that Sherry pointed out in the grave, the hero himself was wearing one of these seal stones, and he's grasping what we would have thought was some kind of a plume of metal on the helmet of his opponent, but clearly he's compressing it with his hand. People always thought this crest was made of metal, but how could it be if it were to be compressed? And we're 99% sure that what it was constructed of were the bristles from the neck of a wild boar. That's on that scene, which you see the wild boar on the right. We are so rich in wild boars. We have wild boar restaurants still today in our area. And when we drive to work, sometimes we have a flock of wild boars walking across the road. Another close-up toward the bottom. This is the guy with the tartan kilt. And the attention to the physiognomy is completely unparalleled with any other representations in art this early in Greece. It's almost another 1,000 years before you begin to have representations of this sort. But I want to call your attention to the sword that lies on the ground next to this dead warrior. It has horns, and it's almost exactly the same as the gold hilted sword that we found in the grave next to the body of the Griffin warrior himself, and that is on display upstairs, and is decorated with that gold embroidery technique that Sherry mentioned. So the Griffin warrior in combat as a warrior, certainly I think that's justified, but there are other aspects to the Griffin warrior's identity, and next we turn to his identity as a priest. We have seals in the grave that show sacrifices taking place. Now, the sacrificers here are ultimately derived from Egyptian gods, a god named Tauret. But they've been adapted by the Minoan artists, I think, produced this, and they're pouring liquid offerings onto an altar. Interestingly, from Apilos itself, from a later date, we have seal impressions that show these same characters, these Egyptian Taurets, sacrificing animals. In this case, they're sacrificing Cretan wild goats again. And on the right-hand side, where that arrow points, we actually found in the grave one of the very same sacrificial instruments that the mythological creatures were using to carry out the sacrifice. And as if that wasn't enough, we found a heavily encrusted piece of bronze, which you see here on the right, that belongs to the Griffin warrior's suit of armor, and probably was over his chest in the suit of armor. We still haven't cleaned it, but in the course of x-raying it, which you see on the right, we discovered this sun symbol with the same number of rays as the sun symbol over the altar on the seal stone to the left. So the Griffin warrior, we think here in the iconography, even for his suit of armor, was presenting himself as being an important figure in religion of his day. There's some more support for that. This is totally unique. It's on display upstairs, although it's tilted sideways, but have a look at it. It's a reclining lioness. And on the other side of this, we have the representation of a priest, in this case, of a sort, the representation that was used to represent priests on the island of Crete by the Minoans. And he's carrying a special type of ritual axe, which has a hole through it. We call it a fenestrated axe. And these are from the these are found in Syria, in the area of the eastern part of the Mediterranean. The actual physical objects are only found in one instance in Greece, and that is in the Vaphio Tholos tomb that I mentioned to you before. So, this leads us to ask the question, was the Griffin warrior a Mycenaean wanox? Now, just briefly, what is a wanox? In classical Greece, there was a word onox, which means king, and it pops up in Homer. In Linear B, that word appears with a letter that went out of use by classical Greece called a digamma, and it's pronounced as a W, so wa and then onox is the idea. And this very word, wanox, it's been suggested by one of our colleagues, now retired from the University of Texas at Austin, that this was a word used by the Cretans in the Minoan language to refer to their king, because the Minoans did not speak Greek. They spoke some other language. We haven't deciphered it as of yet. But the mainlanders borrowed that concept of Minoan kingship, so it seems, from the island of Crete. And by the time of the tablets from the palace, the archives that Sherry talked about, that was the regular word for Mycenaean king. So this was the last thing we found in the grave, and it was a pretty spectacular find. It's on display upstairs too, and it shows a griffin and a lion wrestling in really amazing detail, as you can see in the drawing on the right. Griffins and lions. We can play with this idea. We have griffins on Crete, we have lions on Crete, we have lions as images at Mycenae, but interestingly, several hundred years later, Sherry showed you this image already, in the throne room of the Wanax in the palace of Nestor, we have griffins and lions flanking on the wall paintings, flanking the throne of the king. So, was the Griffin warrior again a Mycenaean wanax? He certainly seems to have been a leader in religious belief, a leader in war, and clearly a leader vested with authority, as we see from the staff. And he clearly was a leader who was marked for burial in a very unique way, keeping in mind he was only about 35 years when he died. This is how we reconstruct his burial ceremony. We know that on top of the Acropolis, at this point in time, there were large mansions. If any of you have been to the site of Akrotiri on the island of Thera, large mansions of that sort, and they had painted walls, but not yet any palace per se, but these individual large mansions that seem to have belonged to particularly powerful aristocrats. So we imagine a funerary procession of individuals coming out of that citadel on top of the hill and carrying the body of the Griffin warrior toward the grave that's been carved out of the clay for his burial. And this would have been accompanied probably also by a funerary feast. In fact, we found burials of a cow in the course of the excavation of the grave. And so we put a little cow into this reconstruction too. He clearly didn't know what was coming next, the poor guy. So that brings our formal presentation to a conclusion. But if you're interested more about the art and the crafts from the grave, we invite you certainly to purchase a copy of The Kingdom of Pylos, which also exists in a Greek edition in the bookstore here at the Getty Villa. And if you still want more, if you're still a glutton for punishment, you can buy, you don't even buy this one. The one on the right's absolutely free. You can download it from Amazon, A Greek State in Formation, which talks about what we think are the formative processes that led to the creation of the first kingdom, the first state on the Greek mainland. And if you want to keep up to date with what is going on in our excavations, you're certainly welcome to come to our website, which is www.griffinwarrior.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sherry and Jack. I'm going to now ask Sherry and Tim to take the stage and have a conversation among themselves and also with you, the audience.
Where do they fit into the time frame of the...
We need the microphone, please.
I think Pelasgians was the question.
I can repeat the question. The question was, how do the Pelasgians fit into the story? Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. Before Heinrich Schliemann dug at Mycenae and discovered the riches there, much of what visitors to Greece observed, especially large stone-built citadels, they attributed to people they called the Pelasgians, which are kind of peoples of the sea. And this even went so far as there was a museum in Paris devoted, it was called the Pelasgian Museum, that had models of Pelasgian monuments from all over the Mediterranean. We don't use the term at all anymore. So this is something drawn from Greek literature and from later Greek historical sources. Probably what early visitors and even people in classical antiquity had in mind were the monuments from the Mycenaean civilization that they could still observe in their landscape.
I wanted to know the figure on how did the warrior die?
Sherry? How did the warrior die?
Well, we don't know. That's a short answer. And we've studied the bones, but there's no indication in the bones for the cause of death. And if you don't have some type of physical remain, it's impossible, given the length of time that has passed, to arrive at an exact cause of death. Perhaps in the future, they'll be able to determine that information from the bones and information that might be stored in them. But today we can't do that, so we don't know.
So we've seen the exhibit, and my sense is that your answers to this is we really don't know. But how did they create those tiny little engraved things? They're so amazing.
Oh, anybody can do it. Well, we wondered that ourselves. And I think you're going to get some of the answer later on in the fall, because a master jeweler from Athens, whom we've consulted with a lot, is going to come here. And I gather run a workshop of some sort in the galleries and to replicate some of these finds. He's also a master seal carver. So, but yeah.
I just might add that there are, in other cultures of this period and earlier, in particular in Mesopotamia, in the 2nd millennium BC, this period, but also earlier in the 3rd millennium BC, where cylinder seals were engraved with designs sometimes almost as miraculous as this. And their tools, we do know what the tools were. They had bronze. In later periods, they had some iron, but that's really in the 1st millennium. So there was a tradition of working these very hard stones and with figurative designs, and as I say, very detailed, almost as miraculous as this. And there were cylinder seals of this kind that were even found in Greece, and Thebes in particular, a hoard of cylinder seals of some of these hard stones. So it wasn't a completely new thing when it happened in Mycenaean times. There was, as I say, in Mesopotamia and other cultures, including nearer to Greece, the Hittites.
I think, Sherry can say more about this too.
The jeweler that Jack mentioned suggests that they didn't have lenses at the time, that they were carving them more by a sense of feel and understanding of the proportions of the various parts, because it's unlikely that they would have been able to see what they were doing, because they were using a fixed lathe, and so they had a spinning wheel, and they were moving the stone against the turning wheel, and they were using a type of slurry of water and emery. So the surface wouldn't have been visible while they were making the carvings. And so he suggests that they started with a larger object, and they understood how the pieces fit together, and they kept working to the smaller and smaller and smaller scale. But clearly, the person who carved this was extremely talented, and although nothing like this has ever been found, it doesn't mean that similar pieces didn't exist. We have probably about 1% of the material, if even that, from the Mycenaean period. So it's amazing that this particular example survived at all, but there were probably others that we don't know about and we might never know about.
This is a good moment maybe to jump in with a comment that's related both to what you're talking about and what Tim's subject. Member of the Zoom audience, Gretchen Hewlett, is asking, regarding the pendants from the second Tholos tomb, that is the Hathor pendants with cloisonne, what clues suggest a provenance from Lebanon?
Well, there's a long history of relations between Lebanon, particularly Byblos, but other cities on the coast of Lebanon, with Egypt going right back into the early late 3rd millennium BC. So there was and many motifs, including motifs relating to Hathor, have a long history, therefore, in Lebanon. And the materials involved, including lapis and other colored stones, in the cloisonne technique like this do appear, certainly by the 2nd millennium and the times of the Mycenaean period in Greece, in Lebanon. So if you had to pick somewhere the most plausible source of this, when it's not actually Egyptian, but in an Egyptianizing style, then Byblos and Lebanon are the most likely source areas.
We very much wanted to pursue that by traveling to Lebanon with a Lebanese collaborator of ours, and just at the point of time when everything recently blew up. But I'm sure we'll get there.
Yeah, we're one in the front. Yeah.
My question is, sorry. You've talked about this excavation as a warrior, possibly a religious leader, and then definitely somebody that is wealthy enough to be considered a prince. But I was wondering if you could expand on the context of him possibly being a merchant, considering that a lot of the finds are from the Near East and a lot of the religious iconography can be connected with Egypt.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Actually, I didn't hear the
Merchant.
end of the
Could
question.
it be a merchant?
Could it be a merchant?
Yes, I think that that's one option, that it could have been a merchant. He could have been somebody who was involved in raids in Crete because the Minoan civilization was falling at this time. It's interesting, though, Jack said that we didn't necessarily agree on where all of the material had been produced. He had things that were produced on the mainland, though, because they were silver. And silver is very rare in Crete at this time, but it's much more common on the mainland and in the Mycenaean culture. I think the reason that it's hard to imagine him as a merchant is because they were very unsettled times. And so if he's carrying this vast wealth with him, traveling, he would have to have a very substantial bodyguard, I would think. The similar material is found in other tombs as well. Yes, I would say yes. We don't know. Unfortunately, we don't have any written records from this time period, but that's a great hypothesis.
Yeah, but Sherry started to say that similar materials found in other tombs. And in the fourth room upstairs, that is some of the material. And there's just not as much as is in the Griffin warrior grave. And I think one idea that we played with is that there was a lot of raiding of the island of Crete going on in this period, which you referred to. So it isn't just, well, raiders are traders and traders are raiders, right? So they are certainly related concepts.
We have another question here. I think that's related. On this question of his identity, you might read it through the objects that he surrounded himself and that his family would have placed there, but you can also, determine some aspects of it through the skeletal material. And one of our attendees asked that you mentioned the DNA evidence has shown that the Tholos tombs were intended for families. Could you say a bit more about that, or other ways that DNA has been used to illuminate the Mycenaean? So I guess it's the DNA studies done on the Griffin warrior himself, but other kinds of analyses done on familial groups? For Jack.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, for Pylos in particular, we're really only at the beginning of DNA studies. We've carried out a pilot project in collaboration with Vienna and Harvard. We know we have the Griffin warrior's DNA, and we have DNA. We've been able to recover DNA from a number of tombs that were excavated by Carl Blagan a long time ago, and they do show familial relationships. So that's what Sherry was concluding. But what we're anxious to do is now to expand this DNA study and to include individuals from our more recent excavations and look at their relationships, if any, with the Griffin warrior himself. Was he an outsider in the community, or was he part of the community? Because the $64,000 question is, why is he buried all by himself if he's part of the community?
One here.
Just to clarify, Sharon, you showed an image of the roof of an intact Tholos tomb, which reminded me of the interior of the so-called Tomb of Agamemnon at Mycenae. Is that an intact Tholos tomb at Pylos, or is that from another site?
That one is reconstructed. It was excavated by a member of Carl Blagan's team, and then it was reconstructed by the Archaeological Service in 1958. And so it's difficult from the image and standing inside the tomb to understand which part was there and which part was reconstructed. But everything above the lintel was put in place by modern craftsmanship using the ancient technique of corbelled masonry to build the dome. The difference between ours and the treasury of Atreus, say, is that we're at the very beginning of the architectural form, and so they're using small stones, as opposed to these wonderfully large, perfectly cut ashlar blocks that fit together hardly with hardly the seams visible. So it develops through time, although it's not a linear progression, but the Treasury of Atreus is the culmination of the architectural form.
I wanted to ask you, so I think you may have answered my question. So you believe that the Griffin warrior was not a member of the royal family, not to be buried in a tholos?
Well, it seems that the tholos tombs were used by competing aristocratic families, and that's why there are multiple tombs in the same area. And then we have this warrior who is buried in a very simple grave and not in a tholos tomb. So the question is why? And it could be, as Jack said, because he was the first king, the first Wanox, and so it's the start of something new. He's an individual who's starting a new dynasty or a new mode of leadership. Or it could be that he's a merchant and he was from someplace else, and so he couldn't be buried in one of the tholos tombs. There are other explanations. Perhaps he died when it was very hot and they didn't have time to open up the entranceway and unbuild the wall and to do all of the things that needed to be done. But again, because we have no written records, we can't say exactly why he was.
But with the wealth of the material that you found, do you think the people that were buried in the tholos tombs had greater items to be buried there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
A friend of mine in Athens has said that if I agree to be buried, if I buy a grave in the First National Cemetery in Greece, she'll include me on her tour of the first cemetery. My point being here is that some people in the First National Cemetery stay in their graves forever. They're not digging up Melina Mercuri, and they're not digging up Heinrich Schliemann. Others, the bones are collected into familial vaults associated with the tombs, ossuaries, and the latter is what's going on in the big Tholos tombs. They may have this may have been quite an honor to put him in a grave in which he'd never be disturbed.
Let me bring in another question from the audience out there, more on a technical area. Was a spectrum analyzer used on the gold to find where the gold was mined? And to that question, I might just add my own about materials analysis that you've been undertaking. What about the blue glass, the Tomb of the Blue Glass? Has that been analyzed? So gold and glass.
Yes, it's extremely difficult to determine the source of the gold, especially because gold is frequently melted down and reconstituted. And so you need to look for the rare elements, the rare earth elements in it. So we have done some scanning XRF that has located some platinum inclusions and various other things that might be able to help us source it. But it's very complicated to determine the origin of the gold, and people are still working out the way to do it. Again, because some of it is found in the surface, like the panning that they did in the West when the West opened. So it's coming from different places, and then again, because so much of it is melted down. The glass, we're looking at the colorants for the glass because blue is unusual, and so we have looked at the two from the Tomb of the Blue Glass, and we also have others. The Tomb of the Blue Glass is using a copper-based colorant, whereas the ones that are much rarer at this time are cobalt, which comes probably from a source in Egypt or a source in Syria and produces a much darker blue. But we were just talking about this. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, and there's even a site I dug in Jordan called Pella. There we had in the early late Bronze Age, so about around the same time, around 1500, broad blue glass spacer beads of the same sort of size and dimensions as. So I think there were centers of this in Syria and in the Levant. We haven't found all of them yet, but certainly we know that Nuzi in eastern Iraq they had, and so it was something that was becoming more common and more available, I think, more generally at this time.
Yeah.
Thank you, and welcome back from 2016. I was very interested to hear you say that you had done DNA analysis had been done of members of some of the other tombs and found familial relationships. Did the Griffin warrior have any DNA that could be that also checked?
Yeah, we have the Griffin warrior's DNA, but we haven't. But what we don't have is DNA from the Tholos tombs nearby the grave of the Griffin warrior, and we tried to get it from the one, that reconstructed tomb that Sherry showed that we just answered the question about, and we struck out, at least on the samples that we sent for analysis. We're hoping that more freshly excavated samples from our new Tholos tombs are going to be, it's going to be easier to extract the DNA. And so we're rapidly collecting the petrous bones, the small ear bones, which is the hardest bone in the human body, in the hopes that we'll be successful in extracting DNA from those. Getting the DNA of the Griffin warrior was extraordinarily complicated. And the Harvard lab, because they were aware of the importance of it, they reran their examinations multiple times. And that's another, I'm glad we weren't paying for that. But they eventually were successful in getting the Griffin warrior's DNA. Different types of relationships. We have father-son relationships. We have marriages between first cousins that we can demonstrate already, and others in Greece from more recent excavations are finding similar results. Kim Shelton's excavations, Kim is at Berkeley, Kim's excavations in the northeast Peloponnesos is reaching similar conclusions.
Okay, there and then there.
Thank you. In the area of the Griffin warrior, approximately how many graves or tombs are there altogether? How many have been excavated? How many will be holding surprises for the future?
That's yours.
Well, there are no other graves, and we've looked both through physical digging and with ground penetrating radar and with magnetometry. And that's what's so unusual about this grave, is that there's nothing like it on the site, and there's nothing like it in other Mycenaean palaces. So it seems to be very unique.
This person's had his hand up for a while. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. You answered my serious question just now with the ground penetrating radar aspect, because I had that question. So I'll ask my facetious question, which is, is there any other iconography showing that downward thrusting cut towards the collarbone and into the chest to avoid armor, perhaps? Is there any other iconography besides that of the movie Troy, where Achilles, Brad Pitt is constantly doing it?
Yep.
Thank you.
Jack?
Well, she keeps passing these to me, and she's the expert in it because she's been talking. She gets advice on killing from
Wait a minute.
from a guy who runs a coffee company in Maine. Where's Scott?
In the Northeast,
in
yeah. Scott
the
worked there.
Northeast, and who was here at the opening of the exhibit.
Yes,
and he
yes.
advises her on kill strokes.
Well, yeah, I mean, Jack showed an image of the
Battle in the Glen, right?
the Battle of the Glen, which
Yeah.
shows the similar death thrust. But it really is, in essence, a death thrust. And so they knew enough about the human body and how to kill someone to be able to illustrate it like that. It's not very common, but there are a few other scenes of battle that we have that show the same, as you say, motion that they showed in Troy.
I have two questions here that, not to the nature of the Griffin Warrior as a ruthless killer, but
No.
as a beautiful man. And from some of the objects that well, seriously, as some of the objects on display
Yes.
repeatedly have to go to his jewelry, his cosmetic implements.
Yes.
And so the two questions, here are, first of all, the fact that he had 4 rings. And do we have any iconography that suggests they wore multiple rings at a time or one at a time? And also, very long hairstyles. What did that signify about this individual?
Okay, since I'm going to go first, and I'm going to take the question about the hairstyle, and Jack can have the one about the rings. As far as the combs, there were about 5 combs that were found in the grave, and I like to compare this to what the Spartans did before the Battle of Thermopylae. And it was a Spartan tradition before going into battle that the warriors would comb their hair in order to prepare. And I don't know if any of you saw the 300, but it's a very moving scene because they knew that they were going to be killed and they were defending all of Greece from the Persian invasion. And what they did in preparation is comb their hair. So it's dangerous to argue with such a large time span in the middle, but there's no reason not to think that this was something that was important as a preparation for battle. I also like to make the point that it's really important that we don't project our assumptions of which objects go with females and which objects go with males into the past, because in earlier times, archaeologists would say if it's a comb, it's associated with a female burial. If it's a necklace, if it's a mirror, it has to be a female burial, because the remains are all commingled in most cases, so we don't know which objects necessarily went with which individual. And here we see a male burial that has objects that we today might consider to be feminine. And so we shouldn't use our gender assumptions and project them into the past. But yes, there's no reason that men wouldn't have combed their hair before burial and used other types of cosmetics.
Then there was the question about multiple rings. There are certainly tombs with multiple rings. I don't know of any example of somebody, a representation of someone wearing more than one ring. The puzzling thing about the rings is that the diameter of the rings are typically very small. And that has puzzled art historians and scholars. I think in large part because they imagined that the rings were pushed all the way down as we wear engagement or wedding rings. Actually, I'm not wearing one, but if I were, it would go all the way down. But we're thinking more in terms of the medieval practice in which the ring is seated between the first and second joint of the finger and then pressed down like this, rather than, which is actually a much easier way to stamp a seal impression than if you have it all the way down here.
Thank you guys so much. My question is, what's next for the site? Do you have any wish lists of things you'd love to analyze if you had the budget, places you really want to dig, things you want to conserve? What's next realistically? What's next in your wish list?
Are you offering? We discussed this earlier in the week with some people who came in from New York. We have one thing we want to do. We need to finish the excavation, which we're not done with, of the Tholos tombs. But then we need to prepare the site to be opened to visitors, to tourists to the site. And that's a pretty complicated program of planning. Exactly how do you prepare a Tholos tomb for visitors? This is not something that many people have wrestled with. The tomb of the Treasury of Atreus is just there and you walk into it. That's not our situation. So what kind of scaffolding, what kind of platform do we construct over top? We want to contribute to the formation of an entire archaeological park in the area. But at the moment, only about 20% of the archaeological site is owned by the Greek state. The rest remains in private hands. So one of our goals is to buy as much of the land as we can which constitutes part of the archaeological site. So last year we bought several acres of land. Sherry and I now own 240 olive trees that we don't know what to do with. So we want to do more of that toward this goal of forming a rather different concept of archaeological site that will attract even more and will be sustainable and will bring more tourists in an intelligent way into our area. Other things we want to do, Sherry?
Well, as far as analysis, I mean, that's endless, looking at the artifacts and the composition and understanding the stones. And this is also something that we talked about. The DNA analysis, continuing that study to see if we can fit him in with the population that we have in the new Tholos tombs. The possibilities are endless.
The suit of armor is broken into some hundreds of fragments, and it's a really complicated job to try to even restore it on paper or electronically. And we have someone working on this. Unfortunately, she spends a good part of the year in Antarctica. She's a conservator, and she works for New Zealanders conserving early explorer camps in Antarctica. But when it gets too cold in Antarctica, she comes to us. So we wish we had her all the time.
This is an amazing discovery that you have made archaeologically and historically, but from a cultural or religious perspective, how did you handle discovering the remains, of this warrior? Was there like a ceremony, or did you have to ask permission from the descendants or anything like that?
It's different in Greece than it is in America. And as Jack described, some of the modern Greek burial customs, they're very different than Native American and than ours, actually, many of ours. And so we will at some point have some type of a ceremony for the bones of the individual. And it's not something that is necessarily, it's not something that necessarily people identify as their particular ancestor so that they want to see them reburied in a certain type of way. It's a different type of belief system. So we work with the Ministry of Culture in all that we do, and we follow the guidelines that they provide for us in how we treat the human remains that we have from the site. But before we close, I would like to ask a question, if you wouldn't mind talking about what similarities you see between our material and the material that you're familiar with in the Near East. You talked a little bit about the glass. Are there other similarities or differences that you note, or things that you might want to comment on?
Well, some of them we've talked about, the Hathor material, which has Egyptianizing origins clearly. Some of the materials, the lapis, comes, we know, from Afghanistan, Badakhshan, so right from across in towards Central Asia. And of course, the other way round, we haven't talked about how the Mycenaeans traded so actively, and therefore we have lots of Mycenaean pottery all through the Mediterranean, in Egypt, in the Levant, elsewhere. So Mycenaean culture was diffused and traded. These vessels contained olive oil and perfumed oils and other things, and wine probably. So there was a very strong and active network, and we have some of the ships that sank and have now been excavated. So the interconnectedness of Greek culture of the Late Bronze Age with the other great Late Bronze Age cultures, and they are just across the Aegean, the Hittites. Then you've got, the Syrian cultures and the Levant, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, and others. They were part of that club of great powers who were great not only in economic terms and culturally and very connected, but also militarily, who from time to time did battle with each other, as the Greeks called by we know the Hittites had a name for them, the Ahhiyawa, maybe related to the word for Achaeans, as we have in Homer. So there were very strong economic, cultural, religious, and other traditions and connections that make this one of the most interesting periods of ancient history to study.
Thank you.
I think that we're going to maybe wrap the questions for now. We have a couple more online, but they go to questions of artistry and materials and functions. And I'm going to encourage you to keep an eye on the Getty website, because we have fantastic programs coming up in later summer and throughout the fall that are going to talk just about some of these issues. So for now, I want to thank Sherry, Jack, and Tim.